Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Science of Kabbalah with your hosts, Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Science of Kabbalah here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. This is your host, Rabbi Yitzchak, and I am here with my favorite co-host, and no, it is not William Hall.
Shalom, everyone. It's Leah, and it's so good to be back with you all. It's such a joy for me to be able to be here with you.
It is my amazing wife, as most of you know. Before we get into the subject of today's episode, we want to dedicate this show to the Refuah Shlema, to the complete healing of my uncle, Hanan ben Fega. My uncle in Texas is 92, and he fell last week, and he ended up going to the hospital, and they said he also had pneumonia, and then he tested positive for COVID. He's having a little bit of a struggle with his breathing. So if you would please daven for him, I'd appreciate that. Also, a very, very dear friend of mine and his wife here in Sfat, my former chavruta, my study partner, Meir ben Polin, and his wife, Chanadina bat Sepora Rivka. And did you have anybody?
Yes, I want to add my wonderful husband, Yitzchak Moshe ben Ephraim.
Yes, as I mentioned last week, if you haven't heard, I'm dealing with some health issues myself. As you can tell with my raspiness, I'm having some issues with my thyroid and my parathyroid that is going to need a biopsy, as well as some other issues that I won't go into right now. But Baruch Hashem, Hashem is always faithful, and he should give a refuah shlema to all of those that we're praying for my uncle, for our friends, and for all people who are suffering out there, for the frontline workers, for all people that have COVID and are battling this megifah, this plague. Hashem, you should please give everyone a refuah shlema and bring the end of this plague soon, speedily, and not just in our days, but this day. Hayom, please, Hashem.
And may we all have good health.
Good health, yes. So we have a few seconds before we go to a break here. I had an amazing meeting on Shabbat as you and I were out taking a walk. We met my dear friend, Rabbi Amichai Cohen, and it's just amazing that he was on the same page. It's something we shared with that we're going to talk about, but you're going to have to stay with us. We'll be right back here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Science of Kabbalah. So, my love, before the break, I just mentioned the meeting that we had with Rabbi Amichai Cohen, and I just happened to be chatting with him a little bit and sharing what you and I were learning over Shabbat.
Right.
We typically learn some Zohar, we learn the Parsha, which happened to be Vayechi, and he lived talking about Yaakov, and of course Vayechi goes into all of the different blessings that Yaakov gives to his sons, who but really were the foundation of and the continuity of the Jewish community, the 12 tribes, so forth.
Right,
and
for
so,
Knesset Yisrael.
Knesset Yisrael. So it became the subject of Achdut, when we talk about this idea of unity in Judaism. And it's something that people are talking about all the time. We know that people are talking about this idea, and we mention this all the time, this idea of Geulah consciousness, this idea of redemption, this idea of coming out of exile. And I always talk about the fact that at the same time, I'm always seeing all of this division, divisiveness, strife that's going on. And we see that now with so many different things. You could talk about the political spectrum in the U.S. You can talk about the political spectrum here in Israel because we're getting ready to go to elections again.
The whole thing with the vaccines and with COVID. It's nuts.
Yeah, so
not
that's
calling anybody nuts. It's just the whole situation is nuts.
No, I understand. You cannot go on social media today and not see some kind of argument going on with people that are typically friends. You see people that would probably see each other on the street, and yet they have different opinions. This one is pro-vaccine. This one is anti-vaccine. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories. There's all kinds of different opinions. And it's okay. That's the beauty of something that we're going to be talking about today, and something that I would probably title, I don't know, what do I want to call it? We'll wait for a second before I get into what I actually want to call it. So I kind of mentioned the idea of Vayechi, this idea of the different tribes, and you and I were looking at a commentary from Rav Soloveitchik. And it's interesting because let's talk about that for a minute. We can talk about the idea of hashkafa. Hashkafa is what we would term outlook, or your worldview as it relates to Orthodox Judaism. So, for instance, there are people that have different hashkafic perspectives, meaning there are all different types of streams of Judaism. We're not even talking about the fact that there's Orthodox Judaism and other streams of Judaism, but within Orthodox Judaism.
Right. We have Breslov and Sons and Satmar and Chabad, and it could go on and on and on.
Right. So the beauty of what I'm talking about is that when we met Rabbi Amichai is Chabad. You and I are not Chabad.
Right.
And yet here we are, both of us meeting on the street with completely different hashkafic perspectives, and yet we were both happened to be studying the same thing in the same week and basically talking the same thing. He actually put out an amazing video talking about how they made Aliyah 8 years ago. Amichai was actually born in Yerushalayim. He was born in Jerusalem, but grew up in the U.S. But he made Aliyah 8 years ago. We made Aliyah 6 years ago. And he was talking about also the same kind of thing that we're talking about today. This idea that, in a way, when you look at Hashkafa and things like that, and you look at the 12 tribes, and you look at the blessings that Yaakov gave to his sons, you could say that they all had these kind of mutually exclusive and contradictory traits.
Right. Each one was different, like very unique and very individual.
Very unique and very individual. And contradictory.
Yes, absolutely.
Totally contradictory, but at the same time, there's no way that they would be Knesset Yisrael. There would no way for them to be Klal Yisrael. There would be no way for the continuity of the Jewish community if there wasn't this idea of mutually exclusive and contradictory traits coming together. Now, so Amichai, besides doing the video about his Aliyah 8 years ago, he actually did another video on an amazing book, an amazing sefer that's called Pituchei Chotam, that was written by Rav Yaakov Abu Chetzera. We know the Abu Chetzera family. Rav Yaakov Abu Chetzera of that family was one of the great Kabbalists of the modern day. And in Pituchei Chotam, actually this week's Parsha, talking about Shemot and the idea of these 12 tribes now that have come into the land, because it starts off Shemot, Ele Shemot. These are the names of those who came down into Egypt. That's how it starts. And in that sefer, his name is Yaakov, the Rabbi Abu Chetzera. His name is Yaakov. And he talks about Yaakov, and he talks about that Yaakov is an acronym for Yichud, Anava, Kiddusha, and Bracha. And what's Yichud? Yichud is unification. It talks about, first and foremost, that the Yud of Yaakov is Yichud, unification, and then Anava, being humility, Kiddusha, being holiness, and Bracha, being blessing. Now, you did your show.
I did my show yesterday, yes.
You did your show, Women's World.
Yes.
And you also touched on this subject as well. And we're both talking in a similar fashion. And before I talk about the Klausenberger Rebbe, I'm always reminded that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, like we're talking about Chabad being one of those streams, the Lubavitcher Rebbe always talked about the idea that we should never label ourselves, that we should never call ourselves Orthodox or conservative or Reform or any of those things. He didn't like the idea of labels. The Rebbe would actually say something like that there are observant Jews and there are less observant Jews. Now, I'm not talking about those other streams of Judaism, but I'm talking about the idea that, of course, as an Orthodox rabbi, I would like to see everybody be more observant. But you know what? I'd like to see myself be more observant as well.
Myself as well. It's like everybody observes something. They're at one level, or I don't want to say level. They're at one place on their path right now.
No, level is fine too. We're all. It doesn't mean that when you say level, it doesn't mean that somebody's, higher than somebody else. The Kabbalah talks about madrega, levels, and we know that even in modern Hebrew, madragot. You and I live at the in a simta, in an alleyway that's by the great stairs, the hamadragot gidolot. The great stairs here in Tzfat that goes all the way from our street all the way up to Rachov Yerushalayim.
That's a lot of levels.
It's a lot of levels and it's a lot of stairs.
Good exercise.
Yeah. So somebody put up a meme about the Klausenberger Rebbe, and the Klausenberger Rebbe talking about these different streams. Rav Halberstam was the founder of the Klausenberg and the Sanz Hasidic dynasty. And one of the things that he talked about, because he survived the Shoah, he was in the camps and he survived.
Right. He actually, his wife and I believe 11 children did not survive.
That's true. And he survived. He was able to make it to the U.S. and then he ended up coming to Israel. And there's Kihila. As a matter of fact, he founded a hospital as well in Netanya, which is where he settled after he came to Israel.
Right,
but,
and he rebuilt his family. He actually married again and had 7 children.
Yes, thank God. But this is what he talked about being in the camp. He said, there's one thing I miss about the Shoah. If you can imagine somebody saying that. And it reminds me of Shimon Ashkenazi, my dear friend Shimon Ashkenazi, alav shalom, that I used to sit with at my Beit Knesset in the U.S. But this is what he said. He said, the one thing I miss about the Shoah, the Holocaust, is that when we went on the death march, we were all clean shaven. Our hair was shaved off too. We marched side by side, and no one knew if the person next to them was a chassid or a litvak. No one knew I was a rebbe. We all just held our arms around each other and tried to keep warm and tried to keep our fellow Jews warm. That's what I miss about the Holocaust. That's what I miss about the Shoah. That's mind-boggling. So when we're talking about this concept of yichud, of unification, of achdut, all of these words having similar roots and similar meanings, we have to realize that we all come from different cultures, that we all come from a different place, that we've all had different experiences, that we've all had different ups and downs, that we've all suffered in some way. We are people that, in the same way as the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Yaakov, came with this mutually exclusive and sort of contradictory traits, that is true of each one of us as well, and that's not something that we should look at to separate us, but it's something actually that should bring achdut. It's something that should bring unification. That instead of seeing those differences in each of us as the thing that separates us, we actually have to see that as a thing that brings us together.
Which reminds me, like with the mechitza, people always see that as something that separates men and women, but the mechitza is actually a connection.
And it's not meant to be a separation, because what do we say one of the other part of the acronym is this idea of kedusha, and that's the idea that mechitza actually brings a connection, but it also brings a level of kedusha, brings a level of holiness as well. We're going to have to go to a break here. We'll be back in a few minutes talking more about the unity of opposites. So stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break here on the Science of Kabbalah.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things. But at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Shalom, I'm Leah Aharoni. Join me on my show, News from the Torah. Each Sunday, we'll use the weekly Torah portion as a prism for understanding the news today. Listen to News from the Torah to gain clarity about the times we're living in and to understand your own spiritual path in the process. News from the Torah every Sunday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Shalom, everyone, and welcome back to the Science of Kabbalah. And what an incredible show we're having so far today. And in our last segment, we were talking about how we studied Parsha Vayechi this past Shabbat and talking about the 12 tribes and Yaakov's blessings over them and how each one of the sons had mutually exclusive and contradictory traits. And I really liked what your title is for the show today, A Unity of Opposites, because as we see in the 12 tribes, there were a lot of differences and opposites with them, yet it took all of them, all 12, to be Knesset Yisrael. And we talked about Achdut and how we all need to have that unity. And even with what the Klausenberger Rebbe had talked about, what he missed in the Holocaust, which is just unfathomable as far as missing how you couldn't tell who was who during those death marches and how they just all held arms and kept each other warm. And that's what he missed about it.
Right. So in this idea of the unity of opposites, it's actually a very Kabbalistic concept as well as a concept within psychology. The people that study Jungian psychology, Carl Jung, he talks quite a bit about this as well, this idea of unity of opposites. When you're talking about in Kabbalah and the Kabbalists, they use a term that's called Achdut Hashva'ah, which is the idea of the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof is related to Hashem in Kabbalah. The Ein Sof, the ineffable God, you could say without end, literally the infinite God. And he is in himself a unity of opposites. I know people don't like to consider that, but it's very true. And this idea of the Achdut Hashva'ah, this kind of unification of the opposites, even as it relates to the Ein Sof, sort of reconciles within itself even the aspects of the cosmos that seem to be opposed to each other and contradict each other. We see different things in the universe and the world that seem to oppose each other and contradict each other, and yet these kind of things come together. In one of the first major works of Kabbalah, the Sefer Yetzirah is talking about form or formation. We see that Rav Aryeh Kaplan did an English translation of this. And in it, in Sefer Yetzirah, we can see that the Sfirot themselves are sort of these mutually exclusive and contradictory traits. We see that with Chesed and Gevurah. Chesed is loving kindness, and Gevurah is this idea of strength or might, and is related to judgment, whereas Chesed is loving kindness. So you see that, and Sefer Yetzirah says this. It says their end is embedded in their beginning, and their beginning in their end, according to Yetzirah. The Sephirot are comprised of 5 pairs of opposites. It says there's a depth of beginning, a depth of end, a depth of good, a depth of evil, a depth of above, a depth of below, a depth of east, a depth of west, a depth of north, and a depth of south. So we have these 5 sort of opposites, and they all sort of come together at the same time. And when we're talking about this, we can't get away also from the concept of exile and redemption. In Vayechi and in all of these parshiot leading up to the end of the book of Breshit, we're getting ready to go into exile. We have the exile that's coming, where they're going into Mitzrayim. And now everybody, we said at the beginning of the show, talking about this idea of Geulah meaning redemption. Everybody is waiting for redemption. Everybody wants to see the coming of Mashiach. Everybody wants to see us coming out of exile. We may not be in exile the way we were in Mitzrayim in Egypt, but in a spiritual sense, we're still in exile. Even living in Eretz Yisrael, even with having the blessing of living in the land, it's still considered that we're living in exile.
Right, I remember when we were talking about that.
Right, and so we have that. The whole idea of exile and redemption themselves are contradictory concepts. Exile sitting opposite of redemption. They're diametrically opposed to each other. In the Kabbalistic tradition, the contradictory concepts of exile and redemption symbolized, on one hand, defilement, and on the other hand, holiness. And you could say klipa and kedusha. Klipa being the husks or the shells, and kedusha being holiness. You could see the opposites of Satan and the Shekhinah. You have Satan being the Satan, who is the malach who tests us, is sometimes related to the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, as opposed to the Shekhinah, which is the divine presence of Hashem. And those battles going back and forth, the forces of evil battling the forces of divinity or holiness. And you have this sort of universal cosmic struggle of heavenly holiness against earthly defilement. We're always talking about the physical and the spiritual. And
with the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara.
The Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, this idea constantly. The study of the Zohar, the main work of Kabbalah, is really meant to decipher the hidden meaning of the Torah, of the Tanakh, of the scriptures, and the fulfillment of the commandments with the Kabbalistic intention alongside a denial of mundane things in order to look towards holiness and elevate ourselves. And this is really, by keeping the mitzvot and by elevating ourselves, this is the thing that's meant to sort of hasten along the redemption. On the other side, when we commit sin, when we indulge ourselves in the mundane things, in the things of this world, then what ends up happening is we kind of end up becoming negligent. And this is when we sort of strengthen the other side, what we call the sitra achra, the other side, the side of evil, the klipot. We allow the shells and the husks to take over. And that sort of, instead of hastening redemption, that is what sort of continues the exile. And so we constantly see this idea. And one of the things we didn't even bring up is, like, I just saw the other day in talking about all of these things, we talked about people fighting about the vaccine. What about Jonathan Pollard? I mean, Baruch Hashem, that Jonathan Pollard has been set free.
Welcome home.
Baruch
We've been
haba.
waiting so long for him and his wife to be able to come home to Israel.
Right. And yet you see this huge fight going on. And typically you see it between Israeli Jews supporting Pollard coming home and thinking that he was treated badly. And then, look, I'm not saying that all American Jews are against this, but typically you see most of the people that have been coming out and saying, why are you treating this guy like a hero, and why are you giving him a hero's welcome, and why did Bibi meet him at the airport? This guy is a criminal, and so forth.
This man was in exile.
It's mind-boggling. He was in exile, and there's no question you can argue one way or the other. Most people don't even really know the full details. If you really go in and you study the details of what he did, the information that he passed on to Israel, in a way, did not harm the United States. It was information that probably should have been passed on to Israel anyway. And the truth is that there are people that murder people that were not in prison as long as Jonathan Pollard was. And I'm glad that Rav Mordechai Eliyahu Zatzal, the father of our chief rabbi of Tzfat, treated him like a son and visited him so many times, as well as Rav Shmuel Eliyahu, our present chief rabbi of Israel. So, but you see all of those things. And again, this is because we have these mutually exclusive and contradictory traits. All of us, whether you're an American Jew, whether you're an Israeli Jew, whether you're Chabad, whether you're a Sanz, whether you're Breslov, it doesn't matter what you are. The thing is to recognize that, and the truth is that not only that, but I think part of the problem is that in recognizing that each one of us have these mutually exclusive and contradictory traits, that there's a diversity of self, that in the same way we're talking about that achdut hashva'ah, that idea that there's a unity of opposites, even with the Ein Sof, with Hashem, then because we have a spark of the divine, then that means that we have that as well.
Right. Each of us are Hashem's creation,
right.
And we need to look at each other as Hashem's creation.
Right. Right. But what I'm saying is that there's also this division within us. And so it has to start first that we need to unify the opposite and the diversity of self, the things within us, those character traits like the Sferot, like Chesed and Gevurah and all of these different things. We have to learn who we are first. And once you learn who you are and you bring unification in yourself and repair in yourself, then and only then can you then criticize and look at another person and complain about their mutually exclusive and contradictory traits.
Absolutely.
That's the most important thing. And so there are examples. We have many different examples about this. And when we come back, we're going to have to go to a break here. But when we come back, I want to talk about one of the greatest examples and one of the ones that I'm spending a lot of time on looking at and having kavanah with and intention with when I read about this is the idea of ketoret, the idea of the incense. So stay with us. We're going to have to go to a short break. We'll be right back here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzchak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the final segment of the Unity of Opposites here on the Science of Kabbalah. This is Rabbi Yitzchak along with my amazing wife, Leah, who's joining me today. And before the break, I talked about getting into the Ketoret, but before that, I mentioned this idea of self. And you mentioned something interesting as we were off air, and it's the idea that in talking about the unity of opposites and having mutually exclusive and contradictory traits, you brought up the idea that here you say something and then I come on and I say something totally the opposite.
Right. Yeah, right.
So this shows you, but at the same time, we have this amazing connection. We have this amazing marriage, an amazing connection, which is interesting because I was looking at my notes and I saw something about Shir HaShirim, which also talks about connection as well. And it is interesting that when you look at the protagonists that are involved, Shulamit and Shlomo HaMelech, King Shlomo, if you look at the root of their names, Shulamit and Shlomo, they come from the same root, Shin Lamed Mem, Shalem, which means peace or wholeness or completion. So there's always that. We always see these kind of things, these, what you want to say, like tensions that are going on, and talking about this unity of opposites. Of course, the Eitz Chaim, and as I said, the Sferot themselves constitute a unity in diversity. There's a unity in diversity, and so the first thing we have to do in recognizing that we have these contradictory traits within ourselves is to understand that we have to accept the diversity of self. I think Amichai mentioned this in the video that he did on this idea of recognizing our differences, recognizing our cultural differences. Because there's not only just like Sanz and Chabad and Breslov, but there are Russians, there are Ethiopians, there are Moroccans, there are Persians, there are Ashkenazi, Sfardi, Chiloni, Masorti. There's all different, and so on and so forth. And it's like we have to look past these things. So anyway, back to this idea of the Ketoret. The Ketoret is the incense that was burned on the altar in the Beit HaMikdash, also in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. And we know the Ketoret, that the word itself also comes from a similar root to the idea of bringing closer, similar to the same way that Korban, the idea of the Korbanot, the sacrifices, also comes from the root to come close. And we have in the Siddur, when we daven, like if we were going to look at Shacharit, the morning prayers in the davening in Judaism, one of the first sections that we do in the Shacharit prayer is the Korbanot, in the sacrifices, and we also have this idea of Petuma Ketoret, the idea of the incense offering that we read about as well. And so we don't just say it in the morning, but we say it at Mincha as well, in the afternoon prayer. And it's said that doing this with Kavanah, that we bring all different kinds of benefits. And in the words of the Zohar, it says if only people knew how great it is before Hashem, when they say the section of Petuma Ketoret, they would take each and every word of the section and place it on their head like a golden crown. Now, one of the things that we do when we say the Petuma Ketoret is we actually count each one of them as we say it. We count it on our right hand. And I was talking to a rabbi friend of mine, and we were talking about this, about the Kabbalistic perspective of this. And it's said that if you really focus in and you have great kavanah in the Petuma Ketoret and the counting of it, that you can bring all kinds of refuot, you can bring all kinds of healings, you can bring all kinds of yeshuot, all kinds of salvations and so forth. Like it says there in the Zohar, this idea of placing these like a golden crown on your head.
And bringing things into unity.
So we know that it's in Exodus chapter 30, verses 34 to 36, is where we read about this, where it says, Hashem said to Moshe, take to yourself spices, balsam, onycha, galbanum, spices, and pure frankincense, equal amounts of each, and then blend them, Ketoret compound, the work of a master perfumer, well blended, free of all impurity and holy, that you shall grind it or pulverize a small portion and place it on the altar before the Ark of the Testimony in the communion tent at the Mishkan, where I commune with you. It shall have the highest degree of holiness for you. We also know that Aaron was to burn the Ketoret on the golden altar early each morning, after he would clean the menorah, after he would clean out the oil of the lamps, and that he was also to burn the Ketoret when he lights the lamps towards evening. It was a daily Ketoret offering before Hashem throughout all the generations. Now, that's only the beginning. There's also in the idea in the next section where we talk about the blending of the Ketoret in verse 34, it lists 4 spices, yet I said that we count out each one, and we actually count at 11. And the verse ends with a term, ba'ad ba'ad yihiyeh, which we translate as equal amounts of each. And that's not like a complete translation, but Rashi explains that part of the process, he explains it as equal amounts, and then Ibn Ezra fills in another aspect by teaching that we are to pound, pulverize, or grind each one separately, and then and only then blend them all together. And so what's the amazing spiritual lesson that we learned from this? It's the idea that when we're saying korbanot, sacrifices, or ketoret, this idea that each one of them has this root in the idea of coming closer to Hashem, is that the derech, the way, the path to come closer to Hashem is by respecting division. It's by respecting separation. Because if we don't appreciate the difference among people, then we really can never become unified. If we don't recognize that, yes, there are Russians and there are Ethiopians and there are Ashkenazi Eastern Europeans and there are Moroccans and there are Persians, if we don't recognize that, if we don't recognize the mutually exclusive and contradictory traits that we have, there's never going to be unification. There's never going to be achdut. There's never going to be yichud. And we have so many examples in history where different powers, governments try to impose their system on the culture of others. And we know that this doesn't work for several reasons. There can be no disappearance in spirituality and the spiritual law of respecting differences. If you think that you can understand this on a simple level, you're making a grave mistake and you're really fooling yourself. We have to meditate on this. We have to even use this section in a repetitive way and experience what you experience. Meditate on it. And this is really the thing. If you meditate and have kavanah related to this, you'll see that you'll recognize the diversity and we'll start to see the beginnings.
Right. And as you said, I think we have to have the respect for ourselves, as you're talking about the respect for others, and also in accepting and respecting the diversity within us, and bringing the unity within us and then out to all these others.
Absolutely. And even if you look at even further and you want to go really deep into the idea of Kabbalah, if you count the words and letters, there are actually 65 words and 260 letters in the first 3 verses in chapter 30, verse 34 to 36. And what does that mean? Well, 65 is the gematria of Adonai, Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, and 260 is 26 times 10, and any student of Kabbalah knows that 26 is Yud Kei Vav Kei. We even see verses that come from the Talmud, from the Gemara, that describe the idea of how we blend the Ketoret, how we put it together, and the quantities and the measures to mix, and the minimum and maximums that you can put together. But you can't look at these things in a physical sense. You always have to look at it in the spiritual sense. And this is the idea of what they were trying to teach us. It's all about this concept of bringing everything together. I mean, I could spend hours on this. I could go into more gematria on the connection of the different words and the connections of the different numbers and the different spices and so forth, and how each one of these spices connects to one of the different sfirot, because we have 10 sfirot, but then we have da'at that sits between chokhmah and binah, which is sort of sits outside, which is sort of the external part of keter, or crown, of the highest level of the sfirot. And each one of them related to one of the sfirot, which we talked about being a unity in diversity. I just want to end with the idea of this, as we said. It doesn't matter what your hashkafa is. It doesn't matter what your worldview and what your outlook is. Embrace the diversity in self, bring unification in yourself, and then we can start to see achdut. And this is not just for the Jewish people. This is even for those of you that are listening that are non-Jews, that have left idolatry, that want to connect to Hashem, that want to connect to Judaism. You are part of that ingredient of the incense that has to come together to bring a perfect smell, a perfect perfume, and something that's going to bring achdut, and something that's going to hasten the redemption. So anyway, we've run out of time, as we usually do. Always happens. So I want to thank everybody. I hope you got something from this. And we look forward to seeing you every week here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.